This is a really big part of like CISOs, especially in the security operations challenge.
Yeah.
You can't have downtime.
Yeah.
Your investigations have to continue. Cases can't sit stagnant for 6 months because you're doing a change. My underlying philosophy as a CISO that we are responsible for delivering the highest confidence information that we can to inform decision makers in a risk-based way what actions to take. Building trust is how you start to create those conditions of highest confidence. You are trusted. You've been transparent, and you're now relaying with confidence a recommendation that you have for action to be taken. What resonates best with me will always be an understanding of the questions that I'm trying to ask myself and of the security posture or the risk environment of whatever it is that I am currently charged with supporting the security of.
Alexis, thank you so much for being here. I'm really excited for the conversation. This is going to be fantastic. For everyone watching or listening, just as a reminder, this is a podcast that we do here at Primary. My name's Tobias. I'm a principal on the team, leading a lot of the cybersecurity investing that we're doing for the firm. We talk to CISOs and other security leaders about how they think about their roles and working with startups and buying software from startups and when and why and through what form they actually do that. And hopefully it's helpful for founders who are listening in. So let's get started. First, it'd be great just to hear your background and get to know your story. And we can kind of go from there.
Great. Thank you so much for having me this morning. My name is Alexis Wales. I'm currently the CISO at GitHub. My background is somewhat non-traditional, I think, for CISOs today. I was in the ending phase of my college time when 9/11 happened. I had family members in New York City and was on a college campus that was very moved by that series of events. Happened to just kind of correlate with the fact that I wasn't sure what I wanted to do next. I had been doing a double major in anthropology and history, very soft sciences, but an area I was passionate about, the kind of study of people and culture. Pivoted that series of studies to grad school down in DC. Joining the military was not the right path for me, but going into security studies was. So I started in 2003, really getting deeper into my education around what strong security governance and security policy looked like for, not just the threats that we as the United States were involved with or engaged in, but what we were seeing really cross boundaries. And by boundaries, I mean, nation-state boundaries, state and local boundaries, company boundaries. It was becoming very obvious that control was going to be a challenge. There was going to be very limited technical means that would allow any particular country, state, locality, business to assert total control over the security of whatever it was trying to secure. So my primary focus kind of in the early days was around what we labeled transnational threats. So this took me into, biological threats. This took me into nuclear proliferation. It was things that would not stop at the border and would impact those who are not necessarily ready for it or would not necessarily have the security means in place. So during that period of time, I was working with the Department of Defense in a policy role. I was a research associate, and I became really, really interested in listening to those in other areas outside of the United States describe what security meant to them. It was interesting to hear what people worried about, what people were concerned about, whether it was in a government role or a military role or, a civilian role. So I would say that my first opportunity to really be a security practitioner was as an observer and a listener. I really took the time to get to know the people, the companies, the government employees who were dealing with some of these really complex and challenging threat areas and working through what it would mean to counter or mitigate those threats. And in many cases, there weren't great mitigation options. So very early on, I started to learn and understand what the acceptance of risk was and what that would mean and how you would communicate that and still keep, a community calm and still keep a community or a state or a locality feeling secure. And, fast forward, took a position with the Department of Homeland Security, became a little bit more domestically focused, but always with an understanding of the importance of international partnerships for the United States. And honestly, for security practitioners, we don't necessarily ever stop at our corporate or our government boundaries. There's always an information exchange happening. And cybersecurity started to really come up as a theme. So now we're talking like 2012, 2016, that time frame. And I became fascinated in how you would develop policies and programs that would help to mitigate threats related to networks and really, really complex networks at that. Started to get closer to those in the IT profession, started to understand what that meant and how that related to the rest of what I had been seeing. My focus, as I said, a little bit more non-traditional from your typical CISO. I approached it from a resourcing perspective. What is your program trying to achieve? How are you measuring the effectiveness of it? Your program is trying to offer security or the sense of security or the opportunity for security. And how are we delivering that from a government perspective or supporting or enabling CISOs across the country in private sector roles? The opportunity to leverage government resources within their own security programs to the benefit of the security of everyone. So my view has always been that the threats we face in the cybersecurity arena are such that stopping at our own corporate boundary is not going to make us as a company successful or the community of security practitioners successful. So I've always kind of taken a bit more of a macro view. And about 3 years ago, I decided that I wanted to move into the private sector and get as close to the network as possible. I wanted to actually take the opportunity to build a security operations program for a company, see what that felt like, see what the challenges were, see what the opportunities were, and really have appreciated my time with GitHub and with Microsoft for the past 3 years. And now I'm really excited to be in the CISO role. Which, as you know, is something interesting for everybody. So
awesome. Well, I want to double click a little bit on kind of risk as a theme. The notion of risk in your prior life was that of national security interests, very different in some ways, but similar, I'm sure, in some ways to digital risk and cybersecurity. And so how does risk kind of filter through what you do now at GitHub in your CISO role there?
So my kind of underlying philosophy as a CISO has always been that as a CISO and a security practitioner, that we are responsible for delivering the highest confidence information that we can to inform decision makers in a risk-based way what actions to take, whether that's the allocation of budget, whether that's the movement of people or decisions around what to do about a particular breach or an incident. And so risk communications are paramount, and landing effective communications is of the utmost importance. So for me, being able to have a conversation with my chief executive officer or the rest of the C-suite at GitHub and have them understand what it is that I'm trying to relay and the time sensitivity or the actionability of that information has been a key part of what I have focused on at GitHub. So I would really say that the underlying information assets that a CISO has available and the ability to do sense making in a way that resonates with those who will have to take the action or that will need to be made aware is a really important part of the CISO role in 2025.
I know another philosophy that's really important to how sort of you lead as a CISO is transparency.
Mm-hmm.
And so it'd be great to hear you speak to that a little bit, how that sort of animates how you approach the role, but also how it filters through to GitHub's own security positioning and philosophy and strategy. Because I know that's something that's super important to you.
It is. And, I am really happy to see that the CISO community and the security community continue to lean into transparency pretty universally. It's been a constant theme that I've seen since the earliest days of my career that security practitioners have been willing to share information with each other, regardless of nationality, political views, anything that may prevent that normal kind of traditional means of sharing. Security practitioners are looking out for the well-being or the health and safety of larger, populations at the end of the day, and trying to make sure that we have security in place so that those high consequence events that can be catastrophic if we're not, aware and doing our jobs don't take place. And so transparency is it is one of those just major themes. Now, for me, transparency is also a key element of building trust. And I think building trust is how you start to create those conditions of highest confidence, so that when you as a CISO are presenting to a board, or you're presenting to, any C-suite, or you're presenting to a partner company, you are trusted, you've been transparent, and you're now relaying with confidence a recommendation that you have for action to be taken. Every action has cost. And so you're asking someone to take away from a productivity budget or to potentially impact downstream customers because you're going offline for a period of time. So the CISO's ability to operate in that realm of constant transparency in order to build that trust, in order to have that confidence, has been a core component of how I've operated.
Another word that comes to mind when I hear you speak through that is also empathy, where part of being transparent and gaining trust is also understanding the conditions in which your counterpart kind of operates and being sensitive to that and contextualizing what you want to do in sort of their reality. And so, we think a lot about empathy in the context of investing in founders and understanding what they're going through and what operators are going through. And it strikes me that that's a core component of kind of how you're talking about leading as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for raising that directly. I think it is so important. We often use that word empathy, but really digging into what that can mean. I agree with you in that the way I approach relationship building, and again, this has come from 2 decades now of working in this space, but that ability to really listen and to make a point to try to understand where the other person is coming from, the other decision maker. I come from a primarily public service background. I'm steeped in risk language from a public service government background. I'm learning the language of product leaders. And it is something that I've put actually a lot of time and energy into, because for me to be able to communicate with a product lead or even an engineering leader within the private sector who's under tremendous stress to keep systems up, to have availability be job number one, and to help them understand that I'm not coming to block or cause friction or prevent innovation, but rather to work in partnership means I have to speak their language. So I have deep empathy that comes from a place of trying to understand what other leaders, decision agenda looks like on any given week, month, or year, in order to be the best partner that I can be.
So empathy required with your counterparts. Let's shift a little bit to talking about founders and startups and how the CISO mindset kind of informs how you think about and perceive different startup pitches and what best practice looks like. My guess is that founders having empathy for everything you just said about how you operate within GitHub and how you have to engage with counterparts to get stuff across the line at GitHub is very important for them in thinking about how to pitch someone like you or talk to someone like you about what they're building. So if you could speak to kind of how you think about founder pitches, what best practice looks like in the context of the role that you now have, that would be super helpful.
So, I'll continue to go on record that I did not start my career as a technologist directly.
Yeah.
I have deep admiration for technology. Technology is a huge part of how we've developed the ability to have confidence in what we are seeing and what we're trying to understand as security practitioners. So for me, when I'm pitched or when I'm working with any vendor, founder, startup company, what resonates best with me will always be an understanding of the questions that I'm trying to ask myself and of the security posture or the risk environment of whatever it is that I am currently charged with supporting the security of. So I have no doubt that many of the technologies that are out there are amazing. Whether or not they're the right technology for me to integrate into my environment is a different conversation.
Yeah.
So getting to that place of familiarity with what challenges I'm dealing with, what questions I'm constantly asking my team, where those information gaps are, and how that new tool, technology, or offering can help fill them is a great way to have a conversation with me that's going to then go to the next step of whether I'm willing to take a chance or a risk on bringing something new into my environment.
Super helpful. It strikes me too that in the same way that transparency and trust is such a sort of core pillar of how you've led, that founders need to also be able to establish trust with someone like you and be sort of transparent, but like show that they're being transparent with someone like you. And I'm curious if there are things that you've seen founders do that have been very effective at like establishing that trust from the get-go, and it could be a high level thing or it could be an example, but I'm curious, if you've seen people do that well.
So it's really interesting. My interactions with founders have honestly been really enlightening. I love to hear what they're thinking about, how they see, a gap in the marketplace, or they've really leaned into a line of innovation around a particular problem. For me, one of the best experiences I've had recently with a founder, and honestly, it is continuing to lead towards a consideration of potential inclusion of the product within the environment, was simply because the person that was there were two founders, both took the time to sit down and say, we've been in this a long time as well. This is the challenge that we continue to see across all these companies, all these governments. This is how this particular approach we are taking does not necessarily conflict with or counteract or, make your sunk cost investment totally sunk cost waste, right? This is an opportunity for us to continue and build upon what you already have, and the downtime of your team in learning how to use this particular new platform or approach is going to be minimal because we're basically just adding on to an already in place process. And they just came from such a place of deep security concept knowledge, and were able to immediately place the particular platform into that context in a way that said, I know you've been doing this a long time. We've been doing this a long time. This is how this will add on and not necessarily detract from your current ongoing operations that cannot stop, right? So I think this is a really big part of like CISOs, especially in the security operations challenge.
Yeah.
You can't have downtime.
Yeah.
Your investigations have to continue. You can't lose, cases can't sit stagnant for 6 months because you're doing a change. So pitching and explaining in that way that already takes into consideration, like, we know what it means for you to say yes and sign a contract with us, and we're ready to help you get up and running from day one, is a big part of that conversation for me.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm hearing a couple of things. the importance of time to value, which is something we speak a lot about, but even more than like time to value, lack of friction, right?
Yeah.
No like 2-month deployments where like you're going to have to change a lot about your configuration of your environment to get something going. Like the less friction and the faster you actually get value from the product, the better.
Yep.
And the importance of just domain expertise and credibility in like relationship building, but also demonstrating that a CISO should trust you with deploying this thing into their environment, which is highly sensitive and risky, right?
Yeah.
So I think those are both great lessons for founders as they're thinking about kind of how to position what they're doing and make the case for their product. I am curious, just to double click on that example for a second. We were just talking a little bit before we started recording about the sort of difference between buying something that you like kind of know you have a problem in, right? And being introduced to a problem that you maybe didn't sort of fully realize that you had, and being like educated on that problem in like a net new area. I'm curious, the example that you're talking about, was that something where it's like, okay, we have this gap, we have this problem, we're going to go figure out a way to solve it? Or is it something that, these founders educated you on and you're like, that's actually an interesting problem. I hadn't thought about that.
So in this example, it was more of we understand the challenges within incident response and remediation, getting to a firm conclusion on the results of an investigation, and tightening up and shrinking the time to act without having to increase your headcount, right? Without having to increase your own internal resourcing. So it was more placed in the context of, security has very specific things it has to do. Incident response is obviously primary. And so it was a very specific part of that flow and a very known area of challenge for all incident response teams everywhere. So it took it from we know this is a universal challenge. We've explored this particular concept. We've run through all the different process ways, and we are very specifically localizing our solution on this particular area. And it was just, I think, the domain expertise paired with the total, relay of, we know this cannot go down, this is how we would make sure it's smoothly integrated in, really landed very well with me. Because yes, it is a gap. And it is a challenge space that we all have as CISOs and incident responders. So from that perspective, that was one of the reasons it landed as well as it did.
Another thing that's interesting about that example is it sounds like the product and the problem space that company's going after is really specific. I think founders sometimes can struggle between, do I tell this really, really big story about all the things that my technology is capable of doing and how I'm going to grow into a platform that solves all these problems for you, versus be really niche and be really specific, which might resonate more on a specific problem, but might kind of like limit the full sort of potential of what I can do. And I'm curious how both of those sort of land for you generally as a prospective user of solutions. Like, do you generally prefer to engage with companies that are hyper specific, or is that just this example?
So I will say this has changed given position, right? At this point, I'm in a well-established security program. We've built it over many years. We're always going to be maturing. We're always going to be improving. Security is never done, right? So for me right now, what we're looking at is scalability and longevity and resilience. And so I am a bit more specifically interested in this role in the niche, the specific. We're not looking for wholesale change out right now. But I have been in roles where absolutely you've got some particular component of some particular industry that is looking to build a security program. And so I have been a part of the evaluation of, what is the cheapest, most cost-effective way to get the most bang for your buck? Because what you're really putting together is the ability to do large scale information analysis, right? And information collection. And so you're going to need a couple of different tools. And if you can get them all in one solution for a period of time, that might make sense.
Yep.
And so there are just so many attributes to what you're considering at the time. But for me right now, a bit more niche, a bit more localized. I know the specific challenges. That's not to say that going into 2025, 2026, 2027, we've got a lot of new language coming out. We've got a lot of new uncertainty that's coming into our security programs. We've got this fascinating convergence with safety programs and safety language when we start to think about generative AI and anything that has AI in the titling. And so I don't know what that means going forward, right? That's a constant question that my team and I ask ourselves is, are we still able to answer the core set of questions that every CISO needs to be able to answer to ensure that we have confidence that our security is where it needs to be? And if that set of questions is no longer answered by the tooling or the systems that we have, then we better start positioning ourselves for change.
Interesting. I mean, we could probably talk for hours about just AI, but I guess just one question on that, because it's such it's impossible for me not to ask a follow-up question when you open the can of worms around AI.
I'll answer what I can.
Yeah. I am curious, like, if you had to pinpoint one or two sort of shifts in how you think about securing applications that comes with this new technology of generative, like what are those things? What would create a situation where existing tooling would not be sufficient for an AI application? Like, conceptually at a really high level seems to make sense, but if you could bring us kind of one or two steps lower into understanding like what's actually changing in the technology that requires new security tooling, I think that'd be really interesting.
So I'll answer where I can, because we are new into this, right?
Yeah.
So we run a bug bounty program, right? We run a lot of security research agendas. We are getting more and more findings, just put it in that labeling, into our systems for us to consider, ask questions of, review proofs of concept, review what is submitted to us through those different programs. Some of them are landing in is this a tactical filter question on the AI side? Is this something that's actually presenting a potential security breach? I mean, we're starting to get into gray and fuzzy space. That lack of certainty of what triage system does it go in? What team does it go to quickly do a review and to make that determination with us of whether or not this is hype, this is, clickbait that somebody's found, this is actually an issue, this is a product issue, this is a product feature, this is a feature, not a bug. Like it isn't as fast as I want it to be. It isn't as fast as, the mean time to response and remediation that we have for what I'm going to just at this point call the more traditional threat environment and vulnerability environment.
Right.
We're starting to have to step back and make sure we even understand what is being submitted to us. And that slowdown of having to question what funnel it goes in for further analysis is where I'm starting to be like, You know what I mean?
Yeah, interesting.
Because you don't want slowdown. You want to know what triage, how to get it into SLA, and how to get it fixed.
Yeah.
And so anything that starts to put a bit of, which team does this go to? Oh, is this AI? Oh, is it this? Like now you're starting to have to make too many decisions outside of your decision trees. And that is not a space that any security leader likes to be in. So
yeah, it's scary to think about how, the AI stuff is infinitely scalable, right? And a lot of what security teams do is people, and people don't scale like AI scales. And so how to deal with that reality, I think is something security teams everywhere are going to have to grapple with as AI continues to become more ubiquitous. I do want to talk for a second about kind of procurement at GitHub.
Sure.
I work with a lot of companies where they try to sell into enterprise. Some do it successfully. A lot of them get stuck in the mud at some point in the procurement process. And it's very common for startups to actually think they're farther along than they are. And so I think, this is a founder audience mainly that watches this. I think it'd be really interesting for you to talk through kind of like what actually selling into an organization like GitHub looks like from a procurement process. What are the tactics? What are the steps? Where do people get hung up? So it'd be great for you to speak to that a little bit.
Sure. I'll talk to it at a high level and feel free
of
to
course.
follow up with any questions you might have.
Yeah.
We are a component of Microsoft,
Yeah.
right? So we have very high standards for how we do procurement of outside technology into our environment. We have privacy standards, we have security standards, we have safety standards. Our third-party risk program helps us to manage against all of those standards. So, there's kind of two questions in what you've asked, which is, if we're looking for something, how do we source it and then bring it into that process successfully? And that is something that is mostly well published on the Microsoft and GitHub websites, how to apply for SSPA, how to start having conversations with us about what those security and privacy criteria are. I think the other thing that is really important to keep in mind, and you and I talked about this when we spoke last week, is the decisions around going forward with the procurement and what that can look like and take. So if we take a general use case that we've decided we do want to take a look at an alternative analysis, we want to start considering different vendors for a problem we're trying to solve. And we're starting to bring in vendors to provide us with demos, to answer questions. The next couple of steps, if we do go forward with procurement, is going to be that security and privacy questionnaire. We take a little bit deeper look than just the checklist. And so for founders or startups to be ready for us to be more than just checked these boxes, and we're going to have conversations about technical integration, what that's going to look like, and what changes or new features could trigger needing to come back to us and to have a conversation with us before it gets turned on post procurement, are all things that we are assessing and considering before we move forward with an actual contract with someone.
And then is it common for your team to sort of try before you buy? Like, do POCs, do partnerships, and what have those looked like in the past?
Yeah, we have. We do. It's usually walled off, sandboxed, obviously. We have done trials. We have done proofs of concept. We've had some very successful ones. Often we can turn on a proof of concept before we go through the entire third-party risk program, right? We really minimize the risks so that we can take a look at the technology and see whether or not it's going to meet our needs. And that has been an incredibly successful process for us. Really builds the advocacy by myself and others for when we need to have a conversation with the third-party risk program or with leadership. So yes, definitely something that has worked for us.
Yeah, it's good to know, because that's often a really nice way for startups to kind of prove that what they're doing is somewhat differentiated. And so interesting to hear that that's been a successful path for you in the past.
Absolutely.
So one other thing that somewhat related to this that I think would be interesting to talk about is kind of how GitHub specifically, and then I guess like Microsoft overall, you think about building versus buying, right? Especially at more, technology forward businesses that have really talented internal engineers and a lot of resources. There's always this question of like, why would you buy something from a startup when you have folks internally who may be able to build something similar? And so it'd be interesting to hear you speak to that and kind of what the risk calculus is on both of those, and when you end up making, a decision to do one versus the other.
So it's always a great question. And I think my lens on this comes from many years of managing large scale programs. And what I mean by that is I've kind of like been steeped in the art of multi-year budgeting and what it means to create resilient workforce, right? So that you are not bringing something in that you haven't fully kind of predicted what the out year costs are going to be, not just for the actual maybe license agreement or, consumption-based use, whatever the particular pricing approach is going to look like, but what it means for the workforce that I manage internally, and how that workforce is also evolving alongside whatever that new technology is. So the choice of Do I invest in engineering skills and talent in order to build against my own information needs or my own security process needs, and then invest in keeping the lights on there and making sure I can upgrade feature? Like, do I have enough?
Right.
It all really starts with, do I have a handle on the health of my business, what my budget looks like, and whether or not my talent management systems are working in such a way that I have agility to maintain the workforce for either the build or the buy. So there's a lot of things that go into whether I consider third-party tech or first-party tech and building internally that are outside of just I don't know that I can do this myself, or this looks really flashy and cool and everybody else is using it. I'm really trying to see 1 to 5 years out whether or not I'll be able to maintain it to the utmost utility of what it is trying to offer.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. I think, it's an interesting kind of question to consider, because a lot of startups wonder this, right? Especially when they're selling into more technically sort of advanced and developed teams. As we've been talking, one question that has come to mind for me that I actually haven't asked anyone else in one of these conversations, but I think I don't know why it popped in my head, but I think it's kind of interesting, is like, when do you respond to startup or founder outreach? Or like, what are the conditions through which it would even be a consideration for you to like take a meeting with a startup? Like my guess is that you get like a countless number of cold emails and LinkedIn DMs every day. Is it about a warm introduction? Is it about a really well-crafted message? Like what is it that actually is compelling in like a very first touch point?
So, I mean, just flat out, the referral network of my trusted peers and folks that I've known, or that, friend of a friend of a friend.
Yeah.
That is, I'm assuming that that's kind of what you mean by the warm introduction.
Exactly.
Like that, if I have someone I've known 5 years ago, trusted security practitioner, and they say, hey, I've heard of this amazing new, startup, this is what problem it's solving, you might want to take a look. I don't care if I'm not even in the market for it. I'm taking a meeting because we know in the security space that when you find something that works for you as a security leader, you share it.
Yeah.
And so like this isn't a competitive environment where I'm trying to be better than other CISOs. This is an environment where the success of my security program means the success of much broader security ecosystem. And so there's often trading of information about what is up and coming, what is looking interesting, what we want to consider. We watch each other's POCs. We talk about what makes something successful. And so that referral network is absolutely a great way to get a meeting and get an initial discussion going.
It comes back to this theme of trust and transparency.
Trust is the name of the game in security, I'm telling you.
Yeah, it's such a prevailing theme throughout this whole conversation. Trust within your organization to kind of like institute the right policies and do the right things. Trust with potential vendors and how they establish trust from your peers on what tooling could be interesting for you and what tooling to check out. And so I love that theme. I mean, it's always nice when you have one of these conversations and there's like a prevailing through line.
Yeah.
And so trust and transparency 100% are kind of the core things, it seems.
For sure. For me anyway.
Yeah. Great. Well, Alexis, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much for the time.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming. Really appreciate it.